Well, welcome to the Dark Ages, otherwise known as the Early Middle Ages. In this session, we're going to be looking at the Dark Ages, otherwise known as the Early Middle Ages. We have covered the classical stream in this course, the Greeks and the Romans. We've also completed the Judeo-Christian stream, which included a summary of the Bible and a discussion of Islam and Judaism and early Christianity. So we're now ready to begin what we now would think of as the main stream, the two smaller streams converging to form the larger stream of Western civilization. It's interesting that Western civilization should begin with what some people have called the Dark Ages, because in many ways we don't know that much about this period. The writing was not widespread. Civilization crumbled, and so therefore there weren't many records. So we only know bits and pieces about this early stage of the Middle Ages, really from about 500 or so until maybe around 800. So that's unfortunate, but that's why some people have called it the Dark Ages. So between the years, well, I've said 500, but really the Roman Empire was collapsing in the 400s. It really went away about 475 or so in the West. In the East, it continued on, but in the West, from Italy and France and Spain and Britain, it went away around 475. And then it really got back on its feet, Western civilization did, around 800 of the current era. It's called the Dark Ages because Rome in the West disintegrated. It just fell apart. It just wasn't viable anymore. Learning diminished. So when you've got civilization falling apart, you've got the structure of government and society falling apart. All the things that depended on that for survival also fall apart. So education went by the wayside. You had a generation somewhere in the late 400s, early 500s that were less educated than their parents. Today we would see, many people would say that they're more educated than their parents. Well, think about it the other way around. Chaos was often the norm because the law enforcement wasn't what it used to be. The economy was unstable, obviously. The system of currency and barter and exchange was not what it used to be. And new barbarian kingdoms were formed where Rome had once ruled. Why did Rome fall apart in the West? Well, it had become way too affluent, and what history teaches us is that when people become affluent, they're less patriotic. They tend to be less focused on the common good and more focused on themselves and their own advancement, their own comfort. Obviously, when people are very poor, that happens as well. But somewhere right in the middle, where people are not terribly affluent, patriotism seems to be more prominent. And Rome got too affluent for its own good in some ways. There was cultural decay. The old Roman virtues were no longer valued as much. It was much more of a, I'm going to get what I can type of an attitude. The size of the empire was too big. The Romans had tried to fix that in the early 300s by dividing the empire into two halves, east and west. But still, it was too large, it was too diverse, and it wasn't able to sustain itself. There was poor economic planning. They spent far more money as a government than they took in. They devised a system of taxation that actually worked in reverse. It actually caused the economy to stagnate. And so there was less money coming in from taxes because people weren't making as much money. So that was poor economic planning. And we've seen that in our own day sometimes, that the government can overreach itself and impose too many taxes, which cause people to earn less money, which causes less tax revenue. And that's what happened in Rome. And then they invested so much when they divided the empire into two. They invested so many resources into building this grand, amazing capital in the east called Constantinople, now called Istanbul. The Turks took that over. But that wasn't until really about 500 years ago. Up until then, it was this remnants of the last Roman presence called Constantinople. And of course, the Eastern Empire did continue for centuries after the West collapsed. Another reason for the decline and fall of the Western provinces were the barbarian invasions. The barbarians were the Germans, the Huns, and some others. And when I say Germans, I mean a group of tribes that spoke similar Germanic languages. The Huns were not. The Huns were from Central Asia, so they were a different people. But you had people like the Goths who spoke a language that's in the Germanic family. You had the Vandals also in that same family. The Franks were in that family as well. Franks invaded what's now France. It was then called Gaul, but they renamed it after themselves, Francia or France. And the Anglo-Saxons, who were from northern Germany, the neighboring parts of the Netherlands and Denmark, and they took over the Roman province of Britain. And so the Anglo-Saxons, which gave rise to the English language, are also of the Germanic language family. And as Rome began to fall apart, the barbarians became stronger and stronger, and they were able to enter the Roman Empire without being stopped by the Roman military, and they were able to invade and settle and take over in many, many ways. On this map, you can see some of the movements of the barbarian groups. It's very confusing with all the different lines and colors, but you can see the barbarians were very active and basically took over the western part of the Roman Empire. So around 475 of the current era, the western provinces of the Roman Empire collapsed. That means that Italy, what's now France, what's now Spain, what's now Portugal, what's now Britain, and some of the other areas in that realm, Switzerland and so forth, fell and were replaced by barbarian successor kingdoms. I want to mention one last vestige of the Roman Empire that remained, and that's best personified in a person called Boethius. Boethius was born a Roman at the very end of the Roman Empire, as really, I think within a year or so after it collapsed in the West, around 475. I think he was born a year or two after that, 477, I believe. So Rome was still kind of there. Some of the structure was still there, but the last emperor passed off the scene about 475. And so it was pretty much over by that time. As he grew up, he was growing up in a very different world than his parents and grandparents had grown up in, but he was still very Roman. He ended up serving as an advisor to the barbarian successor to the Roman Empire in his area, the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great. He served in advisory capacity. He investigated some matters that the king was concerned about. He wrote a lot of books and pamphlets to help the king. But eventually the king believed that he was conspiring against him. He was imprisoned and finally executed in the year 524. But while he was in prison, awaiting execution, he wrote a very influential work called The Consolation of Philosophy. In it, he talks about, how life is uncertain and how you can be on top 1 minute like he was, and then in prison and waiting execution in the next minute, and how life is like that, and how God is the only consolation, and you find consolation in your philosophy and in your faith and so on. And it became one of the most popular works of the Middle Ages. It was a basic text that people studied in school. So what replaced Rome? Well, Barbarian Europe replaced Rome. Gothic kingdoms, Frankish kingdoms, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and others were formed. And you can see on this map, what's now Spain was mainly conquered by the Visigoths, also a group of people called the Suevi from the area of Germany. The Basques in the very north part of Spain, they were not Germanic, they were not barbarians. They had been there long before the Romans. They're there to this very day in northern Spain and parts of France. You can see the Frankish kingdom is in France, but also in other countries. You see the Burgundians are in that area around Switzerland and southern France. The Ostrogoths were in Italy and parts of Eastern Europe. The Saxons were in northern Germany. The Frisians and the Danes were also in that area of Denmark and the Netherlands, and so on. You see so many of these barbarian kingdoms set up. So what system took over? Well, since you didn't have the Romans running things, you had a system called Menorialism. It was one of the two stable elements in post-Roman society in the West. And Menorialism was where you had a local strong person, and they set up a little territory around their estates in which they were able to rule. It wasn't very large. Sometimes it'd be like our counties. So it'd be a smaller area, but they were able to set up their area of influence and control things. And some manors were very strong, some were not. Some got taken over and consolidated with others. And so these began to form what we would think of as the kingdoms of Europe eventually. In the manor system, a wealthy person, either a remnant of the Roman aristocracy that was able to maintain local control, or a barbarian chieftain that had come in and established local control, held a land called a domain on which he supported his family and his servants and basically was the patron of the local area. His tenants, which would be the free commoners and peasants, were allowed to use the rest of the manor land. They worked the Lord's land for him. They farmed his land, but they also had some time during the week to farm their own little piece of land. Each worked a small strip about the size of a half an acre. So they were given that land. It wasn't really theirs, but they were given it to use for their own consumption. Tenants also had the right to use common land, which would be land set aside that everybody could use, but it wasn't for farming, it was for grazing livestock. So if you had a cow or some sheep, you might graze it in the common land. You might cut firewood in the common land, only a certain amount. You couldn't do more than a certain amount, and gathered, herbs and mushrooms and things that you might use to weave baskets or make certain other things you could gain off the common land. Also, the Roman Catholic Church was the other stable institution that took over the leadership vacuum in what was left of Rome in the West. It assumed spiritual and cultural dominance. The lord of the manor would rule, I guess you'd say, politically, but the Roman Catholic Church assumed dominance over the culture and over the spiritual lives of people who by this time, most, if not all, were nominal Christians. That meant that at least in outward appearance, they were Christians. But how deep it went is anybody's guess. The church began to rule from the city of Rome. It kind of like took the place of the emperor in a way. You had this strong person in Rome, and it more or less held together what was left of the Roman Empire. Churches and monasteries sometimes survived barbarian attacks more often than cities and villages. Sometimes the barbarians were a little hesitant to attack a church or a monastery because they thought, well, if we make God angry, that can't be good for us. And so sometimes, even though they would take over a village or loot a village, they would leave the Christian institutions alone. So beginning with the first recognizable pope, Gregory the Great, you'll see the beginnings of what really looks like the Roman Catholic Church. Before Gregory, around the year 600 of the current era, yes, there were popes, there were leaders, but they didn't act like what we think of as a pope today. They were more advisors to the other bishops. They didn't necessarily have full control. Sometimes bishops would ignore what the Bishop of Rome was wanting them to do. But by the time of Gregory the Great, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, became what we think of as the Pope today. He made the decisions, and everybody else was, just expected to do what the Pope said. And that began with Gregory around the year 600. I know that the Roman Catholic Church traces its popes back to Peter, back in the first century. But, and that may be, that's not something I'm arguing with. I'm just saying that the popes we understand today with the full power didn't exist until around the year 600. So beginning with Gregory the Great, the Roman Catholic Church developed an active program for the conversion of barbarian tribes and kingdoms. So, for years, the church was saying, oh my goodness, what are we going to do with these barbarians? And the Roman government, until it fell apart, was intent on driving the barbarians back where they came from, back into Germany, back into Eastern Europe. But by the time of Gregory in the year 600, it became obvious the barbarians weren't going back. They were there to stay. So the church changed its tactic and said, well, let's convert them then. If they're going to be here, let's make them Christians. And so that was what they decided to do. And Gregory was the first person or the first church official to actively set up a program in which the barbarians were to be sent missionaries to, they were to be evangelized, and they were to be brought into the Christian orbit. And Gregory did that, of course. So early Roman Catholicism saw many of these tribal groups converted by means of evangelization, meaning that they just went out and spread the Christian message. The message of what we learned was the gospel in a previous session. The gospel was spread to these barbarian groups. Sometimes the barbarian groups were not all that persuadable, so they were conquered and then evangelized. Sometimes they were evangelized and eagerly accepted the new religion. Sometimes it took a little more force to get them to listen. I think about the Saxons in Germany. They were supposedly converted twice before they really stayed converted. And then, of course, there were offers of cultural advancement. I mean, sometimes the tribes decided to become Christians because they saw that as the way forward. They saw that their paganism really wasn't leading them any place into the new world that they were entering, and so they saw Christianity as the way forward into that. So people, of course, become Christians for all sorts of reasons. Hopefully it's because they really believe it, but in the real world, sometimes it's for other reasons as well. And so that happened with these barbarian tribes. Monasticism, the first monks and nuns practiced a hermit-style monasticism. Monasticism is where you devote your whole life to meditation and church work and prayer and so forth. The first monks and nuns were hermits, meaning they went out into the countryside or someplace out in the desert or in the woods and just lived alone in spiritual disciplines. But Benedict of Nursia in the year 500 founded the first monastic community at Monte Cassino in Italy, in which he saw a whole community of people doing this. So they set up a monastery where the monks lived. There were sister organizations, convents where nuns lived, and they practiced together these spiritual disciplines. They weren't all alone, someplace by themselves. They were doing it together in community. The Benedictine rule was everybody works, there's a job for everybody. Nobody gets a free lunch. Everybody does something useful for the community, whether it's scrubbing the floors, whether it's cooking the food, whether it's tending the livestock, whatever it may be. Everybody had work to do, whether it's copying documents. Daily prayer, everybody prayed 7 times a day. There's a verse in the Bible that says pray without ceasing. Well, what does that mean? I mean, you can't pray every minute of your life. What does pray without ceasing mean? Well, to the monks in the monastery, it meant that you prayed around the clock, that there were times of prayer around the clock. Even during sleep times, you'd get up for prayer and then you'd go back to sleep. So they prayed 7 times a day around the clock, and it was mandatory. And everybody studied. There was no such thing as an illiterate monk or nun. Everybody learned at least some reading and writing, some education. Some, of course, were better at it than others. The monks kept learning alive through their religious schooling. So not only would they teach the new monks that came in or the new nuns that came in, but they would provide school for the local children. And I'm not talking about the children of the peasants. They were not given schooling. We're talking about the children of the lords and ladies of the area, the higher up, the aristocracy. They would send their sons, not their daughters, but their sons to school. And sometimes wealthy middle-class people could buy their way in as well. Eventually, daughters were trained, but only given the training they thought they would be needing as the wives of wealthy people and that sort of thing. But schooling was kept alive. People did learn to read and write, but it was only through the monasteries, only through the church at this point. The government did not have schools. There were very few private schools. All of them were private, I mean, in terms of somebody just setting up a school. It was always through the church. They preserved and copied manuscripts from Roman and Greek times. So you've got to have things for people to read, so you've got to create more copies of them. And so the monks would copy things for their own use, but also for use in these schools. And then the monasteries offered a livelihood and advancement for men and some women who had few other prospects. So sometimes the younger sons and daughters, if they were not marriageable, and of course the sons would not inherit any land or any possessions because the older brothers had already got it, they would sometimes be sent into monasteries because that was a way for them to live and to do something useful with their lives. The church also provided leadership in very chaotic times. For example, Leo I twice preserved Rome from complete destruction. He was a pope, but not in, again, he was before Gregory, so not quite in the sense that you would expect a pope with our understanding. But Leo was able to preserve Rome from complete destruction by the Huns in 452 and 3 years later from the Vandals in 455. They did loot the city. They stole most of the valuable items in the city, but they did not burn the buildings and they did not massacre the people. And that was because Leo said, he met with these barbarian leaders and said, look, we're trying to save people's lives here. What do we have to do? And both of them said, well, if you open the gates and let our people come in and take what they want, then we will leave people and buildings alone. And so Leo said, okay. And so he was able to save the city from complete destruction. Back to Gregory the Great. He was the first of the great Roman bishops to function like a pope, as I've said, in other words, as the head of the church. But the Eastern churches never accepted Rome's supremacy. While the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, claimed to be the head of all Christians, the Eastern churches in Greece and Syria and eventually in Russia said, nah, we don't accept that. So really it ended up being really the head of the Western church. And Gregory is also responsible for Gregorian chant, meaning that form of music that was used in the monasteries and churches for centuries and centuries as a uniform style of music in order to praise God and to lead the people in worship. In some places they still use Gregorian chant. In fact, it's become kind of an art form. And maybe about 20 years ago, there was all kinds of CDs, when you could buy CDs, music recordings of Gregorian chant that people were into for a while. Other church leaders included St. Augustine of Hippo. He was the greatest theologian of the early Middle Age church. Hippo was a city in North Africa. And he was influential in forming a lot the doctrines that Catholicism still teaches, but also some of the doctrines that Protestants teach as well. He formulated, for example, the doctrine of total depravity. Total depravity is believed by Catholics and many Protestants, meaning that a baby is born already removed from God, that already they're separated from God. Already they have a tendency to go their own way and do their own things, oftentimes bad things. And so he believed that that's what the Bible taught, and so this became a teaching of the Christian church. He defined sacramentalism, which Catholics still teach, and some Protestants, not all, but some believe in sacramentalism, meaning that you receive special grace from God through partaking of the sacraments, communion, baptism, and others. And he also explained the fall of Rome, because Rome had become Christian. He explained why God would allow that. I mean, people were asking in his day, look, the Roman Empire accepted Christianity. At some level, the Roman Empire embraced Christianity. And then these pagan barbarians brought the Roman Empire down. How could that have happened? Why would God allow an empire that he had taken so much trouble to convert? Why would he allow the barbarians to bring that down when they didn't even believe in him? And he wrote an explanation of that called the City of God. And the City of God dealt with a lot of other things as well, but one of the main reasons was to explain to people that, hey, God promised he'd build his church. He never promised he'd preserve Rome. And so his argument was, has the church been destroyed by the barbarians? And his argument was no. In fact, the barbarians, some of them have already been converted into Christianity. So he is building his church. He just never promised that the institution of Rome would continue. And that actually helped people to kind of cope with what was happening around them. So I said that Rome in the West fell apart, but what happened to the Roman Empire in the East? And in the East, scholars now call the Roman Empire in the East, after the West fell, they call it Byzantium. They call the organization the Byzantine organization. So when you hear Byzantine, just think it's Rome continuing on in the East. It survived the barbarian conquests of the West. The barbarians tried to conquer the eastern part of the Roman Empire too, but they were not successful. And probably the greatest of the Eastern emperors, or Byzantine emperors, was Justinian, in which the eastern part of the empire grew to its largest extent in the 500s. It reconquered parts of Italy, parts of North Africa. So, I mean, it reconquered some of the Western Roman Empire for a period of time. And Justinian was probably the greatest of the Eastern emperors. You can see the original Eastern Rome was in the purple on the map, and then the areas that Justinian was able to reconquer are the orange areas to the west or to the left. So parts of southern Spain, North Africa, parts of Italy. But it only lasted during Justinian's reign. Justinian was actually the last of the Latin-oriented emperors. Although he ruled from Constantinople, his family was more Latin-based than Greek-based. After Justinian, the Eastern emperors were all Greek-oriented, Greek-speaking, Greek-cultural, but he was the last of the Latin-based emperors. He commissioned a new law code called the Corpus Juris Civilis, and it reformed and streamlined and clarified Roman law, and that was used as a basis for a lot of the laws in the Middle Ages. He instigated a major building program that included a great cathedral which was taken over when the Turks conquered Constantinople in the 1500s. They converted it into the largest mosque in the world. But it's interesting that when Justinian commissioned it as a church, he caused a huge painting of Jesus, the head of Jesus, in the dome of the church. And when the Muslims took it over, they didn't dare erase the picture of Jesus, because even though Muslims don't accept him as the Son of God, they do accept him as a prophet. So you go into this huge mosque, and looking down on you is Jesus. It's a kind of an amazing thing. Anyway, that's the Hagia Sophia in what is now Istanbul, but then was Constantinople. And many scholars credit much of his enterprise, much of his advancement, much of his success to his queen, Theodora. She's a very interesting person. Many people like to do research papers on her. She began as a courtesan. Basically, she was a stripper. She was at least accused of having been a prostitute. Mostly what we know about her is from a writer of the time called Procopius. And Procopius was no fan of Justinian or Theodora. He did not like them. So it's hard to know how much of what he says about them is true. But it seems that since nobody really wrote anything that contradicted Procopius, that we don't have any records of anybody that says, oh, this is just utter hogwash. It may be that really was what she was. She was a very sensational, very beautiful woman who managed to use her beauty to climb to the very top of the Roman Empire. Apparently, Justinian met her for the first time at sort of a bachelor party and fell in love with her. They had an affair, and, basically, she said, we need to be together. And Justinian said, well, I can't do that. It's against the law for somebody of my class to marry your class. And she said, well, you're the emperor. You changed the law. So he did, and he was able to marry her. There's one incident in which she figures very prominently. Justinian was hard on people. He taxed them very heavily, and people didn't like his tax. People didn't like some of his harsh measures to rule the empire, so there was a lot of resentment against Justinian. But in those days, just like the Super Bowl is with us, those people were really into chariot racing. They were fanatical fans of different chariot teams. And there was apparently a real rivalry between the blues and the greens. So there was a blue chariot team and a green chariot team, and people were really divided over it. And we think our Raiders fans are really loyal and difficult. Well, in those days, the blues and the greens, people would kill each other because I hate people who are for the green team, or I hate people who are for the blue team. And so there was a match between the blues and the greens in the big arena, the chariot races, and forget which one was winning, but there started to be a riot between the two teams. And finally, somebody stood up, somebody with a loud voice, and said, "Wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. We may hate each other, but don't we all hate Justinian? Isn't Justinian our real enemy?" And everybody went, "Yeah, we shouldn't be fighting each other. We should be fighting Justinian." So it was called the Nika riots, because Nika, and we get our sports equipment Nike from this term. Nika means victory. And so they chanted Nika, 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 victory, victory, victory. And so they began to pour out of the arena and march on the palace to overthrow Justinian. Justinian's guards came to him and said, "Hey, we've got to get out of here. This is terrible. They're gonna kill you." And so Justinian went to Theodora and said, "Pack whatever you can in a few minutes, and we've got to get out of here. We're going to leave. We're going to get on a ship, and we're going to go." And she made the famous remark, "I think that purple is a lovely color to be buried in." And by that she meant, look, it took me long enough, and I worked hard enough to wear purple. Purple was the royal color. Only the nobility, only the royalty, only the emperor could wear purple. And so she's saying, I can wear purple now. I have worked my way up to the status where I'm a ruler. And she says, I'm going to die a ruler. I am not going to die penniless in exile. So I think purple's a great color to be buried in. And Justinian basically says, "So you're not leaving?" And she said, "I'm going to stay here and wear purple to the last breath of my life." And so he told his soldiers, "All right, go do what you have to do." They went out and slaughtered hundreds and hundreds of the rioters and managed to save Justinian's throne. And people thought that, this was all because of Theodora and her determination. She eventually died of the plague, one of the plagues that went through, and they said Justinian really was never the same after that. Let's talk about early church councils. From 325 to about 1000 of the current era, there were more than a dozen church councils and synods, which are small councils, that were brought together for the purpose of clarifying Christian doctrine and officializing church policy. So understand that Jesus and the apostles, they taught certain things, but they weren't put into systems. Those teachings were not put into systems or categories. And also there were issues that people wanted to know about that were not taught by the apostles or by Jesus. So the church had to sort of come up with categories and try to put the bits and pieces into categories to answer these questions from Christians about what do we believe about this or that. Some of the more notable meetings at these councils which decided these things include the councils of Nicaea in 325, very important council. Early Christian, I guess you'd say, theology was hammered out at the Council of Nicaea in 325. Again, the Bible had taught these things already, for centuries. The New Testament had been around for 300 years, the Old Testament longer than that. So it wasn't that these things were new, it's just that nobody had quite put them into a system where many of the questions people were asking were answered. There was a council at Constantinople, at Ephesus, Chalcedon, and other more local councils called synods at Hippo and Carthage. So many of the basic things were finalized during this time. The Eastern Church went its own way, especially after 1054, when the Roman Pope, Leo IX, decided that the Eastern Church was needing to be brought into line. And so since they wouldn't obey everything he said, and because they disagreed about certain other theological issues, Bible issues that we would look at them today and say that there's not a ton of difference there, but apparently they thought that the differences were big enough to argue over. Anyway, the The Pope excommunicated the churches of the East in 1054, and of course the Eastern Church turned around and excommunicated the Western Church. So Pope Leo of the Western Church, Pope Leo IX, and then the Eastern Church was represented by the Patriarch Michael Cellularius. They excommunicated each other, and they have not revoked those excommunications to this very moment. East and West are divided in terms of Christianity. Protestantism later separated from the Western Church, but not until the 1500s. So, Protestants are part of the Western Christian tradition along with Roman Catholics. The Eastern tradition includes the Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Syrian Orthodox, and some others. Remember, we talked about Islam, which arose in the 600 CE and began to dominate all the way, all the way into Spain for sure, and Portugal. By 711, Islam had jumped into Europe, into Spain. It conquered Spain within about 10 years and was into France by 722. It was beginning to conquer France. It had conquered about half of France until in 722, the Frankish leader, Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, Martel is hammer, defeated the Muslim Moors. Moors are North Africans, at the Battle of Tours in central France. Sometimes it's called the Battle of Poitiers, because I think the battle happened between the cities of Tours and Poitiers. So they defeated the Muslim armies. They drove them back into Spain, in fact, back into central Spain. The northern Spanish areas continued to hold out as Christian areas. And his grandson was Charlemagne, which we'll talk about in a minute. In the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Byzantines faced many centuries struggle with Islam. Islam began to grow and spread, and so the Eastern Roman Empire began to lose territory. You can see it century by century, it's shrinking. The Crusades were an effort by the Eastern Christians to ask the Western Christians for help against the Islamic invaders. The Western Church responded in the Crusades in the 11th century. But in Spain, of course, they didn't respond because they had their own Muslims to fight right on their own soil. So the Crusades were the French knights, the English knights, and some German knights. But in Spain, they were fighting Muslims in their backyard, so they didn't really respond. And for 700 years, the struggle continued between Islam and Christianity in Spain and Portugal. The Islamic area of Spain was called Al-Andalus, and even today, southern Spain is called Andalusia. The Crusades lasted, and we'll talk about them in the next session, but the Crusades lasted for a couple hundred years. But eventually, Islam reconquered everything, and that was the end of that. Islam did make some contributions to Western civilization, for example, mathematics. The numbers we use are called Arabic numerals. They weren't invented by the Arabs, they were invented in India, but we got them because of the Arab traders that brought them from India, so we called them Arabic numerals, the 1, the 2, the 3, and so forth. All you have to do is think about the Roman numerals, which were used before, and they were very confusing. The Islam preserved and copied some ancient Greek manuscripts of philosophy, so some of what we have from the ancient Greeks we get through the Muslims, who copied some of it. We get some music and art from them. We get architectural styles and techniques, especially in the Hispanic world. If you go to Mexico or Spain or someplace like that, we call it Spanish-style architecture, but a lot of it is really Arabic style. The Spaniards got it from the Arabs, from the Moors. They were more advanced in the Middle Ages in medicine than Western Europe was. And of course, they had a major impact on Spanish and Portuguese language and culture. We'll talk about that more in the next session. Around the year 800 of Charles the Great, Charlemagne, or we call him Charlemagne, he was able to bring a lot of Europe back together again. We believe that he's the king in the rhyme of Humpty Dumpty. Many of you may know that rhyme. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty was probably the Roman Empire. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. The Roman Empire fell. All the king's horses and all the king's men, that's Charlemagne, couldn't put him back together again. Charlemagne tried to bring the broken pieces of the Roman Empire back together again into a new Rome, but he was only able to do that for his lifetime. It didn't really stay together after he died. So in the year 800, Charlemagne sought to revive the legacy of Rome by establishing the new Holy Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire presided over by the emperor himself and his descendants and the Christian church. The old Roman Empire was not presided over by the church. Charlemagne's empire, you can see in blue, it included most of France, some of northern Italy, parts of Germany as well. So let's summarize these Dark Ages, or these years of the early Middle Ages. They're often called Dark Ages because of the fall of Rome in the West and the chaos of the next several hundred years. Many important things occurred during this period, including Europe was completely restructured into a shape that we would much more easily recognize now. France as a nation began to become together, not as a part of the Roman Empire, but as its own entity. Britain, Spain, some of those areas began to take shape. The spread of both Christianity and Islam. Christianity took over much of Europe, but then was replaced, at least in Spain and Portugal, by Islam. And then the beginnings of social systems and institutions which still shape our world. The Christian church, we think of some educational organizations, we think of other kinds of things as well. So that is how Western civilization began to shape up.